Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and the 7th video on Genesis 1 verse 1. Yes, this will be the last video on the first verse of the Bible, at least in this series, before we move on to verse 2. But you might be wondering, I have already talked about the word Shamayim or heaven and the word erets or earth. Wasn't that the end of the verse already? What is there left to say? Well, the fact of the matter is that both in Hebrew and in English, sometimes an expression of two words can mean more than the sum of its parts. Sometimes they can even mean something different altogether. Now the consensus is that in Genesis 1 verse 1, the phrase heaven and earth is a so-called merism, a figure of speech that in this case means everything. Similar as in English the expression I have searched high and low for it means I've searched everywhere for it. Or she moved heaven and earth to finish the project on time means she did everything she could to finish the project on time. Alright, that's it. End of the video. Nah, I'm messing with you. Because it's one thing for a commentary or a preacher or a YouTuber to say, ha, it's a merism and it means everything. It's something else to actually show that it is a merism and that it has that meaning, and add some nuance and background in the process. So in the rest of this video I'm going to look at a few other places where heaven and earth, or Shamayim and erets, are used together. Then I'll look at some other expressions that also mean everything. Next I'll share a few thoughts about the worldview of the ancient Hebrews, since it's a bit of a hot topic nowadays, as well as one of my pet peeves. Finally, I'll wrap up with a little preview of what's coming in verse 2, and why it is even more complex and interesting than verse 1. Heaven and earth. Here is a selection of phrases in the Bible where Shamayim and erets are used together to express everything or everywhere, so you get a feel for how it is used. First, a few examples of how it represents everything that is created. Psalm 115 verse 15. May you be blessed by the Lord who made Shamayim and erets. Isaiah 44 verse 24b. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the Shamayim, who spread out the erets by myself. Jeremiah 32 verse 17. Ah, Lord God, it is you who made the Shamayim and the erets by your great power and your outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. And here are a few verses that use these two terms in slightly different contexts, while still meaning basically the same thing. Deuteronomy 3 verse 24b. What God is there in Shamayim or on erets who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? This verse indicates that there is no God like the biblical God anywhere. Joshua 2 verse 11b. The Lord your God, He is God, in the Shamayim above and on the erets beneath. Clearly suggesting that the Lord is God everywhere. 1 Chronicles 29 verse 11. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the Shamayim and in the erets is yours. Again pointing out that everything everywhere belongs to the Lord. Now there is one particular way in which Shamayim and erets can be used together that is a little bit different and immensely intriguing, namely as witnesses of a sin or a crime or a covenant. This starts in Deuteronomy 4 verse 27a. I call Shamayim and erets to witness against you today. And again in chapter 30 verse 19 and 31 verse 28, the same thought is repeated. At first glance it doesn't make sense. Why are inanimate objects called as witnesses? Are they conscious? Or is it a metaphor for something? Perhaps. But if you study the macro structure of Deuteronomy, you will find that it roughly follows the structure of a suzerain vassal treaty, where a more powerful king forces a conquered and less powerful king to become his vassal. In the context of Deuteronomy, this means that God conquered Israel, but not by defeating them, but by liberating them from Egypt. There's a lot of theological depth here. Now, in any proper Caesarean treaty, there is a section where the terms and conditions are stated, followed by a list of witnesses who will enforce those terms and conditions. They will be called upon in case the treaty is broken and will exact punishment on the offending party. These witnesses in other cultures are their respective gods. But that wouldn't really work since, in Deuteronomy and the Bible, there is only one God. There's no other God that God could call upon as a witness. So instead, he calls Shamayim and erets as witnesses. In other words, all of creation is a witness for this treaty, and all of creation will ensure the proper execution of the terms and conditions. And sure enough, when Israel's prophet Isaiah begins his book, he calls on Shamayim and erets as witnesses against his people that they have broken God's covenantal treaty. In Isaiah 1 verse 2, he says, "Hear, O Shamayim, and give ear, O erets, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me." And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, a similar thought appears in Job as well. In Job 20 verse 27 it reads, "The Shamayim will reveal his iniquity, and the erets will rise up against him." So clearly, Shamayim and erets can be used to refer to everything, or everywhere, or all of creation in various creative ways and in a number of contexts. It therefore makes sense to read the expression in Genesis 1 verse 1 in the same way, that in the beginning God created everything. But Shamayim and erets isn't the only expression used in the Bible to say everything or everywhere. So let's have a quick look at some other expressions that are used. 1. The heaven, the earth, and the sea. Psalm 146 verse 6a. Who made Shamayim and erets, the sea, Yam, and all that is in them. 2. The heaven, the earth, the seas, and all deeps. Psalm 135 verse 6. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in Shamayim and on erets. In the seas, Yamim, and all deeps, Kol Tehamoth. 3. The heaven, the earth, and the water under the earth. Exodus 20 verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in Shamayim above, or that is in the erets beneath, or that is in the waters under the earth. Mayim mitachath la'aretz. This is by no means an exhaustive or even representative list, but merely 3 illustrations. The reason I bring this up is simply to show that you can expand the expression heaven and earth with a few different things. Most commonly with something like the sea or water or the deep. It is also optional to include the phrase and all that is in them. So Israel's poets, prophets, and historiographers had a few different options at their disposal. My pet peeve. Now, among my fellow Old Testament scholars, it is popular to talk about the worldview or the cosmology of the ancient Hebrews. It is frequently pointed out that they were likely geocentrists who believed or assumed by default that the Earth was at the center of the universe and that the sun, the moon, and all the stars moved around the Earth. This is likely true, though I would add that there is no place in the Bible where the author explicitly states this. It can, however, be inferred from a number of poetic and idiomatic expressions, and from the fact that it was basically the universal opinion of all peoples everywhere before the Copernican revolution in the 16th century. Taking it one step further, some biblical authors may have believed, or assumed by default, that the Earth was flat. But that is by no means certain, and can only be proven by taking a few verses out of their poetic, idiomatic, rhetorical, or metaphorical context, and forcing a hyper-literal interpretation upon them. The reasons why some groups of scholars do this varies. Some do it to illustrate to students of the Bible that you shouldn't take the Bible literally, in the sense that you need to take things like genre, history, and context into account. Others do it to illustrate that the ancient Hebrews were stupid and had no idea what the world looked like. And even others, and in this group I do not include Old Testament scholars, do it to prove that the earth is flat and that all Christians must reject the ball earth theory. This reminds me of that meme where you have a tug of war and you suddenly find very surprising allies pulling on the same side. However, regardless of one's motivation, illustrations like this one, which I nicked from Wikipedia, often make the rounds, where the Earth is not only flat and stationary and the center of the universe, but you also see things like the pillars of the Earth, the grave or Sheol, and a solid sky dome. Each of the aspects of this image deserves a long video by itself, but let me just, since this is a pet peeve of mine, make a few brief, general comments about what I believe is wrong with pictures like this. First, though each element can be supported by a proof text, the vast majority of those proof texts are poetic or idiomatic in nature. Often, the words have an uncertain meaning or form metaphors, similes, synecdoches, metonymies, merisms, anthropomorphisms, polysemies, or other figures of speech. Second, most of the proof texts only mention one or at most two or three of the details in this image, meaning that there is no single text anywhere in the Bible or anywhere in the ancient Near East that describes all of these elements and how most or all of them supposedly relate to each other. The final image is therefore the result of a bunch of proof texts haphazardly thrown together. Third, for every proof text that is included, there are several texts that are ignored, since they would not fit with this image. The image drawer had a picture in his mind, then drew it on paper, and then went to look for proof texts. There was no systematic comprehensive selection of texts first, which were then synthesized into this image. I can illustrate this by showing different reconstructions of what this ancient Hebrew cosmology supposedly looked like. Superficially, they looked the same, and they were in part inspired by each other, yet if you pay close attention to the details, you will find that they are all different. Here are some examples I gleaned from Dr. Paul's book Oorspronkelijk, so you can see them for yourself. If the Bible had a single, consistent, and probably wrong cosmology, then it should be relatively easy to reconstruct it and put it in a single image, right? So then, why are all these reconstructions so different? Additionally, these proof texts are flattened, squished into a chimera of a reconstruction, and stripped of all context. Then, a lot of details and relationships are not even from the Bible, but from Mesopotamian myths. So not only are different authors who lived centuries apart assumed to have the exact same cosmology, even though their minimal descriptions of it are wildly different, they are also harmonized with texts from another culture and religion. A culture and religion that, by the way, is also extremely diverse, varied, nuanced, and contradictory. So, in the end, and I'm wrapping up this rant now, it is almost certainly true that the ancient Hebrews had a cosmology, or several cosmologies, that were very different from ours. They were very likely geocentrists, and possibly had a number of other beliefs and assumptions about the structure of the universe than we have. But images like this do not, in my opinion, show the cosmology of the ancient Hebrews, as though it were definitively and clearly reconstructed from the Bible. These images can in some sense be helpful, especially as a warning against genreless, context-free hyperliteralism, but if you run into a text in the Bible that appears to talk about any of the elements in this picture, do not, I repeat, do not go to this picture or any picture like it to try and understand what the verse or the expression really means or refers to. Look at the text itself, its genre, its context, its figure of speech, and how the element finds meaning in the phrase, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, and the book. Looking forward. In the first video in this series, we saw that the word Bereshit could be understood in at least two different ways. As in, it could be in the absolute state, where it would mean in the beginning, or it could be in the construct state, where it would mean something like in the beginning of. As we shall see in the next two videos, the words erets and hayata pose a number of interesting syntactical and grammatical questions that are of vital importance for understanding verse 1 and the rest of the chapter. But then there are also the questions of, what does tohu vabohu mean? Empty and void or desolate chaos? What is the darkness and what is the deep abyss? And who or what is the Spirit of God and where did those waters come from? So there's plenty and more to look forward to in the coming videos. Thanks for watching. If you want to support me on Patreon or become a member on YouTube, follow the links in the description so you can see my videos early, vote on topics, ask questions, and more.